And welcome everyone to the fifth of what will be 12 Revolutionary Sundays, Revolutionary Fourth Sundays for this epic year that is the centennial of Malcolm X. My name is Zaid Muhammad. I am going to walk you through a conversation that I am so looking forward to. I'm looking forward to your responses and to your enthusiasm and to your learning and to your embrace. And I serve as the chair for the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee. I'm going to make some preliminary remarks. Our guest, Herb Boyd, is already here. We're going to miss his co-author and our comrade Don Rojas, who cannot be here for health reasons, and we're sending healing energies to Don. Don has been facing a lot with his health in recent years, as some of you may know. So we're sending him healing thoughts and hoping he gets the rest and the recuperation and the energizing that he needs. And we'll have a very serious conversation about some very important developments in the land of scholarship on Malcolm X that we owe a lot to our guests. Just by way of background, today is a loaded day. First and foremost, MXCC, who we are. I want to apologize that we are no longer on Facebook, not to our own doing, but just by virtue of Facebook's reaction to what we do, our page was dismantled the day after the International Day of Solidarity with the people of Burkina Faso, for which we have absolutely no apologies for. Our page was totally taken down as a consequence of that. Some of you who have been following us in that land know that we have at least 10,000 supporters in that space, literally from all over the world. And we missed the interruption that has occurred as a consequence of that development. But we're going to press forward anyway. Here we are on the land that is YouTube. Second, today is African Liberation Day. And it is also the fifth anniversary of the epic spectacle killing, police killing by none other than George Floyd. And of course, as we all will remember, in the face of a pandemic, uh, that particular incident, a proverbial straw that broke the back for many in this country and many throughout the global black world, triggered the most or the largest protest summer in the history of the United States. We'll have some remarks about that, but it's important to note just how loaded this day is. I shared to some of my comrades who were doing actions on this day that one of the actions that took place in Benin, right, that part of Africa that is where a lot of us who wound up in IT and other parts of the Caribbean and the United States come from, is believed to be where George Floyd's family is actually from. That George appears to have been a Folade, as we would say in Yoruba. And that Folade, once his family ancestor was captured and brought here to these shores, became Floyd, the way they undo who our identity to make their identity matter in the way in a very colonial and in captive way. There's a whole book out on just who George Floyd is that came out a couple years ago, and some of that information may be there. But I wanted to particularly shout out Mambo Queen Mother Dewoti Desir, who, as a Queen Mother with direct ties to Benin, was a part of ceremonies that were healing ceremonies that were done for Floyd's family and for the global African world in the aftermath of that. Right. So we observe African Liberation Day, we're going to observe it politically, culturally, and spiritually. So we want to lift that up. We want to shout out everybody who's doing this work, trying to beat back the brutal, racist, and increasingly fascistic hand of the state that was so horrifically dramatized before all of our eyes when George Floyd was killed. I want to shout out Melina Abdullah and Black Lives Matter grassroots. They were just in Minneapolis and have been back and forth. This is an example of what I'm talking about. Some folks that I know in Jersey that I work with, the People's Organization for Progress, Lawrence Ham and Dingwall Chung is going to be doing an action on Tuesday. I did a cultural action in Newark. In Newark, we actually have a George Floyd statue at City Hall. We did a cultural action at the George Floyd statue this past Friday, and I'm sure there are other actions around the global Black world that reflect those of us who were, as some say, in the land of our current culture, 10 toes deep in resistance to the scourge of police brutality. And then, when we got taken off of the Facebook map, only because of some vibrant energy that is taking place in Africa among young people in Africa, right? The age demographic on the African continent is young as it's ever been in quite some time. And Africa, and as well as the diaspora, is all above with what we see in the Sahel, the emergence of the Sahel alliance that includes Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And when we may be seeing some things emerging in other places that are looking to build out that alliance further. And it is a healthy, healthy development that we support without apology, and without any hesitation or reservation. Malcolm was a Pan Africanist. And as a part of his international march, he brought so many of us, particularly everybody from that epic moment, that epic decade that was the golden age of our struggle through the 1960s. He was our gateway to our return to that space, right? So we need to make those observations and appreciations as we begin to do this conversation. This is our practice. I'm going to do a 2-point libation statement, one to acknowledge his ancestors, and one also to acknowledge the ancestors of the Grenadian Revolution. Don Rojas was a survivor of the overthrow of the New Jewel movement. Grenada does not have one revolutionary tendency in Malcolm's Garveyite mother. The New Jewel movement was something special and electric that was a beacon of light and hope throughout the global African world, even though that was Grenada as a space, geographically, as a small space, beautiful, small spice island, right? But that moment between 1979 and 1983, when they were interrupted by a coup, was a beacon of light throughout the African world. As a young man, just in my 20s, I have my own stark memories of just what that meant to folks as young as me and the folks who have been veterans and in the trenches for quite some time. So we want to lift that up. And in our remarks, we also want to acknowledge the fact that our guest was just on a delegation of Black men and women from our area, from the States, who sojourned to Grenada to help lift up the emerging of a Malcolm X Memorial Foundation in honor of Malcolm's incredible mother, Louise Langdon Norton Little, that brave, bold, brilliant, multilingual woman who stood courageously with Mr. Garvey, and it cost her dozens of years out of her life, and it cost her beloved husband, Earl Little, Malcolm's father, his very life, right? So we want to weave all of these things into this tight, very inspired hour that we're looking for. So let me just do a very brief, modest statement, 2 parts: Malcolm's ancestor and the New Jewel ancestors, and we will go right to work with our guests. For the 4 directions, the north, the south, the east, the west, we say Ibaye, Ashe, Ibaye, Ashe, Ibaye, Ashe, Ibaye, Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. Oh, for his mama. We are all come from the wombs of our mothers. Louise Langdon Norton Little, secretary for the Universal Negro Improvement Movement's Negro World, that's seminal publication by Mr. Garvey's organization. A woman so entrusted by Mr. Garvey and his leadership that she was also a part of Mr. Garvey's underground. Yes, when you stand up tall and like that, you're going to be harassed by the state as Mr. Garvey was. For Louise Little, for Malcolm's brave mother, we say Ibaye, Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. For her partner, the brave Earl Little, who was working on an international petition to the emerging League of Nations and antecedent to what his son would later try to do and ultimately cost his son his life, right? For Earl Little, the brave, courageous Garvier straight out of Georgia, who was killed in September of 1931 by black legionnaires, not in Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama, but in the state of Michigan, in the up south of this country. For Earl Little, we say Ibaye, Ashe, Ibaye, Ashe, Ibaye, Ashe. Was brave big sister, Ella Little Collins. For 60 years, we have observed the pilgrimage to this gravesite that was crafted and conceived by Ella, who studied her brother assiduously, so much so she understood his call for the liberation of the African personality even before the OAAU was formed and created something called the Sarah Little Preparatory School in Black Boston. And she understood with the haunting killing of Patrice Lumumba and what was done to Mr. Lumumba, literally cut to pieces and put in the acid acid. They were so afraid of Lumumba, even in his death, being a place for a rallying cry. And she said, "We need to have something for my brother so nobody forgets who he is." And she crafted that. She was the one who would also finance those epic trips abroad. He wasn't getting grants from Archer Daniel Midland or Chase Manhattan and none of those, relying on our resources in the way that is our tradition. She was that source of light and strength and resources that had her little brother's back. For Ella Little Collins, we say Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe. Tragically, just a few years when he lost one of his twin daughters, right? When he was killed on that fateful day on February 21st, 1965, his beloved queen was pregnant with those twins who never got to meet their legendary father, right? And Malika, the one that we lost, and in fact, it was Malika who had those important documents and remains that would later become a tool for our guests to help craft some very important contributions to the literature of Malcolm X, right? That we lost just a few years ago. For Malika Shabazz, we say Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe. And he had a grandson, a brave, long-legged young man, loved martial arts and music, right? And he was just trying to figure out how to use the Shabazz name to become a personal bearer of international solidarity in his own right when we lost him for Malcolm Latif Shabazz. We say Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe, 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 oh. And for his beloved queen, Betty Bahia Shabazz, what she endured, a virtue of her stand with her husband and trying to carry on his legacy in her own way of grace after so many years, right? For Dr. Betty Bahia Shabazz, we say Ibaye Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. Now the second part, October 19th, 1983, Martyrs of October from the Grenadian Revolution. The Prime Minister, the beloved Maurice Bishop, we say Ibaye Ashe. Unison Whiteman, Norris Bain, Fitzroy Bain, we say Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe. Keith Haley and Evelyn Bullen and Jacqueline Kraft, who was actually pregnant herself when all of them were put before a firing squad, if you can believe this, on that fateful day. For all of them and their brave contribution in their moment, we say Ibaye Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. So we end as we began with the four directions: the north, the south, the east, the west. We say Ibaye Ashe, Ibaye Ashe, 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 Ashe. Oh, thank you, brother and sister. Thank you much for your patience. let's get into this conversation. Uh, Baba Herb, welcome to this moment and this platform.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Thank you for what you've done and what you did. Your output, let me just say this from the beginning. Your output just within the last 10 or 15 years or so, how many books have you dropped just within these last few years? You've dropped quite a bit. Your output has been incredible. And I want to lift that up. Writer to writer, student to teacher, I got to lift that up. How many have you put out?
Well, I think one of the ways you want to do, oh, thank you again for the invitation. Thanks for having me here. I'm sorry that my co-pilot, my partner, is not with me, but I think he is. He may be watching us. He may be listening in, Baba. And what one of the things about this is that I was thought about it coming on the show. I was thinking about May 25th. Where was I when the ALD, African Liberation Day, was created?
1963.
Yeah. In 1972, we had the celebration. I was teaching at the as Oberlin University, Oberlin College, Conservatory of Music at that time, teaching a class on the history of jazz and working with a number of musicians there, bringing Black studies into the Oberlin network.
Wow.
And we took time out to have a celebration on May the 25th because the classes were just coming to an end. And it was my second year teaching there. And I only did 2 years there because I had to come back to Detroit and continue a whole lot of organizing there because we had a number of developments, including the whole rebellion of 1967. There was still some residue of that. We had to take care of Black studies at Wayne State University. So that day is a very important day for revolutionaries all over the world. I mean, even when we talk about the centennial of
Yes.
Malcolm as we're
Yes.
going through right now, I mean, it was like a global celebration.
Yes, sir.
The whole solidarity that Malcolm talked about, reached a critical point of fruition. And coming back, you mentioned earlier talking about Malcolm's mother and the pilgrimage that we took down there, led by the indefatigable Dr. Ron Daniels, who
Yes.
at this
Keep
moment
going.
I think is in somewhere in California dealing with reparations and everything. But it was his IBW, the Institute of Black World 21st Century,
Yes.
that was essentially the organizer and leading this delegation. We had people from all across the country. I
Yes.
mean, from California to Maryland to Washington D.C. was with us, and a very powerful, strong delegation of women. And I
Yes.
think that was like
Yes.
absolutely appropriate in view of the celebration, the commemoration we had in hand, the kind of inspiration derived from Louise Langdon Little, Malcolm's mother. And we went to the place where she was born, way up in the mountains,
Yeah.
of Grenada. How she got out of there was something that I've been trying to understand, get my arms around that, that, deep in the underbrush, suddenly this woman emerges and becomes like an international personality. And even more so with the celebrity, or I should say, the absolute authority and rising of her son, um, to say nothing of the other members of her family. I was listening to as you went through the libations, the number of Malcolm's siblings who were also so crucial
Yes.
in giving him his education about
Yes.
Pan Africanism and
Yes.
internationalism, and they should not be excluded. They have often been excluded in a number of presentations, documentaries, and films, and the credit has been given to others. But we can't forget his older sister, in particular, Hilda.
Hmm.
And there's a couple of important biographies on the life of her mother. But Hilda did much of the research and all those compiled the documents and everything. And of course, there's Wilford and Reginald and Filbert. Wesley. The family was tight, had a number of possibilities that were just intercepted by tragedy at one stage or another. And I think some of the people you were mentioning there are a part of that kind of retinue of tragedy
Yes,
that
sir.
visited upon the family. But nonetheless, and we look at the daughters now who continue, particularly Ilyasa and Malak, who continue. And we had a great, I don't know if I sent you a couple of pieces. I don't know if you received them or not.
I just saw your article for the Amsterdam,
Okay.
May 19th at the Shabazz Center. Yes, sir. And we're going to post
Yeah,
that
the
in a moment. Yes,
turnout was great there, uh,
always.
as expected.
Hmm.
And of course, Ron had the opportunity. They gave him a Vanguard Award, and he had an opportunity to give a few words about the delegation that went down to Grenada. But all of this is coming together in the kind of global solidarity that Malcolm talked about, and what Don and I have been trying to capture to some extent and set it up for future scholars to dig a little bit more into this particular legacy, this particular intrigue, of Malcolm connected up with government agencies who had him in the crosshairs, something that he suspected all along, Zaid.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Of course, he was correct. A whole lot of us were in those crosshairs, but he was definitely a prime target. I should mention too, as you lift that up, some of the folks on that delegation. I mentioned Melina Abdullah and Baba Akili from their organization, from our own organization. Charles Asakili Mitchell was on
Yes,
that delegation.
yes.
Monifa and Lumumba Bandele, right? Two of
Oh
our
yeah, my
prized vets
neighbor.
from New African independence.
And
Uh,
Lumumba.
yeah, yeah. It was a very young Kim Poole, very bright, brilliant young sister. Who I was actually trying to get her on our show this past Friday, and she's now in Rome with Cam Howard as they try to advance that question of reparations with the Vatican, right? Because the church at that time was very instrumental in the sponsoring or the blessing of
Mm-hmm.
the slave traders if they if as long as they carried that Catholic whip with them amongst their all the weapons that they used to enslave our ancestors. So there's a place for them in the reparations conversation. It was quite a delegation. I would have gone myself. I had already committed to join the National Reparations Rally in D.C. that Nkechi Taifa had organized
Mm-hmm.
for that weekend, and she wanted me to address it that Saturday. And you can't be talking about Malcolm and not keep your word. So I had to bite my tongue and own
No
up to what
doubt.
I said I was going to do. But I was certainly trying to get there because it was a powerful thing to do. And I should also acknowledge too, as you lift that up, that IBW, and I really appreciate Elder Ron for what he's done with IBW. Also did a delegation several years ago to honor the New Jewel movement, right?
Right,
This
right.
space had been just, as we tend to in the carrying of our trauma sometimes, we tend not to talk about, those things that we need to talk about in order to learn from them and heal from them and to grow from them. But it took decades for that space to have that acknowledgement of just what
Exactly.
the New Jew movement was. So I just want to lift that delegation also
Mm-hmm.
that Don was able to be a part of, because he really, we could have lost him in that wave of madness, just like we lost Maurice and everybody else. And he
Oh, and
truly
yes.
is. We were and grateful not just that he survived, but he survived and came to us. Right? He got to work with us.
Mm-hmm.
He became our comrade in a very real and a very intimate way. I cherished when he was at the Amsterdam News. I wonder if the NAACP appreciates who they had when they had him. He really made a mark as for the revolutionary journalist that he is, and so I just wanted to make sure that we lift all of that up in that conversation. But now let's just get into this thing a little bit. This It also represents for you a continuum of your own contributions to important writings on Malcolm's legacy, right? It's out of print for legal reasons, but everybody whoever can get their hands on it should get the Malcolm X diary that you
Oh, yes.
co-authored with Ilyasa, and that was one of the
Indeed.
documents
That's
rescued from when Malika had her issue some years ago down in Florida, right?
mhm,
Um, Manning Maribel, for all of his gifts, we did some good things before the book that he did, but we were all disappointed and frustrated and quite confused, to put it mildly, with what he did with his Malcolm X: A Life of Reinvention, that triggered not one but two full book critical essays in response to it. You, Haki Matabuti, and Maulana Karinga were responsible for one of those
mhm,
responses. Malcolm, real, not invented. And then you and Don started hitting to us in articles about this strange guy that was popping up in Malcolm's travels in Africa, and what that could possibly have meant for the broader dark eye of the CIA, on
mhm,
top of what we already knew about the FBI and the New York City Police Department and all those other state security agencies that were stalking Malcolm the way they tend to stalk us when we start really making powerful moves like that. And that finally came together with this book. And this book goes beyond just that particular subject. You cover Walter Rodney, Paul Robeson, right? Y'all really cover some territory in this book, and I'm really glad you were able to get it out, right? And we should be shouting out Hakeem Booty and what he's
mhm,
done for Third World Press for all of these years. He created a space for us on Malcolm's call for self-determination and us managing our own resources. We thank him for having that space for you to get this out, and we need to
mhm.
in that string or strand of continuity of what you produce. We want to let's just get into this, right? Um, the diary. You should say something about the rescue mission that became the diary, because I don't know if everybody understands that, and we want everybody to appreciate that, because just as one of the ongoing dimensions of resisting oppression is the reclaiming of our stories and our and the material bases of our stories whenever we can. And we had that very unique story that happened with some of Malcolm's papers that had to be
Mhm.
rescued when
Ooh.
she had some challenges some years ago. Why don't you tell us that, and just walk along the process and how you ultimately got to this book that you just dropped.
You're absolutely right that looking at the trail, the paper trail that led, first of all, to the diary, and then, of course, to the current book, Malcolm X, CIA, and Other Blacks. It goes back to, and I think you mentioned her name in your libations, one of the daughters that was centrally involved in getting Malcolm's memorabilia um, stored in a warehouse down in Florida. And what happens with that process is that if you don't keep the payments up, then they'll notify you. You get two or three notifications, because I've gone through this with several other uh, celebrities who also got caught up in situations where they had stored away their very, very personal and private collections, and then ran into difficulties and they couldn't keep it up, and then suddenly this stuff was going to be auctioned off. And in an auction situation, it's always crated up or boxed up, so the buyers don't know exactly what they're purchasing. They're given some hints that this is a very important collection. So, in other words, to intensify and increase the whole price of the selling of the merchandise. Well, anyway, the family, for some reason or other, it fell in a situation where they couldn't keep the payments up, and suddenly this stuff was taken out of Florida and put up for auction. Went all the way out to San Francisco to an auction house out there, and it went up for auction. I discovered it by someone sent me an email and said, "Hey, Herb, what is this stuff on eBay? You know, all the Malcolm stuff on eBay." So I went on eBay and I saw they had begun to list. They had started listing all of the merchandise that had been coming out of. I mean, it's obviously you had to open up the crates to know that you had that stuff in there to put it up for auction. So I quickly got in touch with Joseph Fleming, who was the family lawyer at that time. He's no longer with us.
Right, right.
And he brought the court injunction and stopped the auction. And the stuff was crated up. There's two huge crates were put together and sent to the Schomburg. The family asked that the Schomburg be the recipient and then kind of the receptor reservoir of that information temporarily. And then eventually they sign a contract for an extensive contract to keep it there at the Schomburg. So Howard Dotson, who was the chief curator at that time, he called me up. We had a long-standing relationship. And he let me know, "Hey, Herb, come on over. We're opening up these crates." And I got the photographer, James Gilbert, at the Amsterdam News. We went over there. And when, I felt like Howard Carter, opening up the the tomb of Tutankhamun, in Egypt. I was hoped that the kind of tragedies that followed that individual would not be, a part of my history. But anyway, I got there, we opened it up, and one of the first things I saw, Zaid, was the travel notebooks, the diary that he kept.
Yes.
And it was a meticulous keeping of the diary. And of course, Malcolm was keeping this particular document because, well, he knows, first of all, that he's a historic personality. Everything he does is going to be significant. So he began to keep a document of his travels. This is in 1964 now. He's no longer a member of the Nation of Islam.
Right.
His political aspirations can be recognized, realized, and expressed, something that he could not do freely within the constraints, the kind of a political straitjacket, he called it, of the Nation of Islam. So now he's making another trip to the continent, to Africa, to parts of Europe and the Middle East. He had done it previously in 1959.
Yes, sir.
But that was like a reconnaissance,
Right.
looking at the lay of the land in preparation for Elijah Muhammad's trip there. So he had no intentions of going to Mecca at that time. But on the second trip, he certainly had that in mind, and it's going to happen. But okay, so now you've got the diary. Even the very problematic aspects of that, and you touched on it, is that having the family all on the same page was very challenging and did not happen. There's some difficulties there. So I was working with just the executors, and Nessie Yassin and Malak were considered the executors at that time. But some of the other two or three other sisters were not in concert with that and began to protest it because, they were not a part of this then. And to some extent, it may have been, I dropped the ball on that. I should have made sure I brought all of them together before I put that up, and not just working with the executives of the estate, but getting their cooperation. After I figured I had the executors, that it was understood that the other sisters would be a part of it. And that was a mistake, perhaps, on my part. But anyway, the book went ahead. I got in touch with Hakeem Adabuti and let him know about this. And he was very excited about the project. Wanted to, let's do it. And we got it all together. Obviously, the thing ended up in court.
Yeah.
And all kind of going back and forth on that. Eventually, we won the situation in court. But by that time, all of the real momentum and energy of the project had been dissipated. And it led to almost a bankruptcy for Third World Press. and we had to struggle to get back. And so we only printed a limited number of copies of the guy. So I'm saying to our listeners, our viewers at this point, say, if you got a copy, hang on to it
Absolutely.
because it's a collector's item at
Yes,
this
it is.
time. Yes. But anyway, it was significant because it was the diary that clued me into understanding some of the people that was in this year kind of a cortege or retinue of people who were surrounding Malcolm wherever he went. And there's one individual, Leo Clinton Aldrich was his name before we discovered him as Leo Miles.
Right.
You know, so he pops up on 10 different occasions in Malcolm's company and going to 4 different countries too. So it's kind of like the speculation on our part. It's like, how is this guy managing, first of all,
Whose
to know,
resource?
yeah, to know his itinerary, to know
Mhm.
exactly when and where, his destinations and everything, and then have the wherewithal, the resources to go ahead and travel right along with it and be there in the same hotels and what have you. So suspicion was is that Malcolm always figured that he was under surveillance by the Central Intelligence Agency. However, he may have figured it was a white agent. He would not perhaps
Mhm.
be considering the possibility of a black agent at that time. So we're saying that, hey, maybe he wasn't an agent. Maybe all he was just a hanger on, an informant, someone who was just interested in Malcolm, happened coincidentally to be in the same place at the same time. So it's a lot of circumstantial evidence. But one of the things that bothered me and Don was the fact that who is this individual? So we started to do some research on Leo Miles. We traced him all the way back to his college days when he was studying Romance languages, when he was also acting. He was out in California at that time, going to the University of California. He was also acting in films. He was in a film called The White Witch Hunter with Susan Hayward and Robert Mitchum. He was one of those natives in the village there. So
Mhm.
it's hard to identify who exactly, where was he among that so great gathering of African people that gathered to be in the film. But anyway, it was like a clue to his whole make believe thing, So here he is, acting, playing a part of one of the so-called Africans at that time, and then later on, after completing his college career, he ends up in Africa of all places. Yes, because now he's an internationalist to some extent, and so he's interested in getting involved, and possibly the CIA had
Mhm.
contacted him at that point because if they had any interest in any black person being in there, they had to have certain kind of what you might call preparation for that in terms of linguistic aspects and understanding of what the whole assignment was. And that may have come as a result of his contact with some other members, including Eduardo Matlani, who brought him into Frelimo.
Yeah.
Now, here's the Front for the Liberation of
Everything.
Mozambique.
Yes.
So
Yes.
how does you go all the way? So you try to track him from, the whole background in film and education, and suddenly here he is, in Mozambique as a member of Frelimo. And as a member of Frelimo, Eduardo Matlani, who was the head of the organization, he was always traveling and moving around. So he left Leo Miles in charge, and that was a mistake because he began to just disrupt the whole organization, expelling people, putting folks out. A very contentious situation was created with him being there.
It's
And
one of
so
the watch was one of the behaviors of a provocateur, by the way. Gotta be
exactly,
in there.
yes, to go in there and just disrupt things and the whole, what you might call the intentions of the organization aside, are pushed aside, and then you have them fighting among themselves. He's creating tension in the organization. So finally, it got to be so bad that they kicked him out of the organization. Now, this is again 1964 when it kind of reaches the apex of the dissension there. So, where do you find him next? He's no longer a member of Frelimo. Even before that, he's created a lot of what you call anti-organizations, opposition organizations against Frelimo. And then he's no longer there. He's out of Mozambique. He's out of Africa. He's in the Middle East. He's in Cairo in
Mm-hmm.
1964 when
Mm-hmm.
Malcolm arrives there. And there he begins to hang on to Malcolm from moment to moment, from country to country. Heaven only knows what he was doing. We have no idea. We speculate that either he was a paid agent to some extent, or he was just an informant that was sharing information to them. He got in touch with them, and then or they set up a situation prior to that. He's still trying to put all of that together because with two scholars that I met, in the consequence of all this, who have a book that's coming out, a fully developed the biography of Leo Clinton Aldrich, or Leo Miles as he came, but he changed
Wow.
his name again. He had
Mm-hmm.
as many names as Mike as Malcolm. And I contacted his former girlfriend, and
Yes.
she was
Yes.
like saying that, hey, he nowhere in the world he could be an agent. I was with him, but she had no idea who he was because
Mm-hmm.
I was telling her things that she had no
No.
understanding of.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
how could you say anything about him if you if you didn't know somebody see basic information about who he was and his background? But anyway, these two scholars who are East African authorities, they've been working on a biography of Leo Miles, and I thought it would be out by now. I was in touch with them a couple of months ago, and they said that it should be coming out shortly. So maybe that'll give us a better understanding. They feel at this point they're up in the air about whether or not he was an agent or not, and I can understand that. Until you have conclusive evidence, you should not be saying that someone is something if they are not. You can run into a lot of problems like that. But anyway, we just saying we never really call him an agent. We speculate circumstantially he is an informant, and he has got all this information. How does he? For what purposes we no understanding of. But the book is less to do about, him and more to do about the agency itself, as
Yes.
they
Yes.
call it, and
Yes.
how they touched on so many African Americans. Malcolm becomes what you call the fulcrum of it all. He's the stimulus. He's the genie right there that they're trying to nail at some point. But there's so many others out there. I mean, even before Malcolm, our research take us all the way back to Hubert Harrison in the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
1920s and
Mm-hmm.
Malcolm and Marcus Garvey movement. Of course, it was not called the CIA back in those days, it was the Bureau of Investigation. But I think Jeffrey Perry, before his death, did a tremendous amount of research on Bureau, and particularly as it pertained to the surveillance, of Hubert Harrison and a number of individuals around Hubert, and then later on, right into the UNIA and members there. So then you move from there through you mentioned earlier Paul Robeson, for example, and and I mean, goodness, Kwame Ture, Walter Rodney, Muhammad Babu. It goes in an international collection of individuals, many of them connected with Malcolm. So that's a lot of we try to pull together. It's a heck of a stew of intrigue there. They try to sort out and put the pieces together, and there's still so much work to be done there because when we contacted the CIA, it's like they sent us like 20 pages, but half of them were like black pages. They had
Oh, that,
redacted the stuff.
yes.
It made no sense at all. They could have kept that. But there's so much more that they're still holding on to, the dossier that they compiled there. And we was hoping that in the recent release of documents that a little bit more light would be shedded on the situation. But most of that had to do with JFK and with Dr. King,
King. Yes,
and hardly anything. I didn't see Malcolm's name mentioned at all in the latest release of these documents compiled by the government agencies. So it's more than just the CIA. It's the Department of Justice. It's these under surveillance. It's the FBI. It's a number of other organizations, government agencies as he moved, State Department agencies, as Malcolm moved across, the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Europe.
One of the things that you pinpoint, or the diary you help share out, that the diary pinpointed is when Malcolm got poisoned. I mean, the time he spent in Cairo was quite significant on both legs of his second and third journeys, right? And it was on the second journey that he gets poisoned, right? And it's interesting that that character, among some others, were around uh, when that happens. But let's go a little. I want to come back, and I'm going to use the language that young folks use that I don't use much. But let's look at the intersectionality of this in other CIA behaviors that you touch on in the book. It's important to look at and appreciate Mr. Robeson, right? I'm
Mm,
not just saying that because I'm from Jersey. Robeson's from New Jersey, but Robeson and the Civil Rights Congress and William Patterson, they actually did what Malcolm was getting ready to do. December
exactly.
17th, 1951, they dropped that petition charging the United States with genocide over the violation of our human rights, with a particular emphasis on lynching the way they did, anticipating and appreciating the emergence of the socialist bloc that came out of the Second World War, the end of the Second World War. And of course, as Malcolm gets going, there's a major growth of a number of nations breaking the shackles of colonialism in Africa and in Asia that give us more possibilities for allies on that front that Malcolm was very ready to try and take advantage of, right? But the Robeson antecedent, share with us a bit about the importance of the Robeson antecedent and others like that.
But no doubt about it. And we have like a whole chapter that we deal with that. And a lot of the information that I have compiled over the years about Paul Robeson came from his son, Paul Robeson Jr., who I spent quite a bit of time with in a number of situations and very personal too. And he shared with me a lot of documents and, of course, the whole Martin Duberman book, which is kind of seemingly the definitive aspects there. Of course, Paul Jr. has some differences with that, but
Mhm.
it was just a
The rest
matter
of
of
you,
like,
yes.
yeah, what interpretation, how much information you're going to share, and your understanding of it. But if you check the chapter we have in the in Malcolm X and the CIA and other blacks, is that Paul Robeson, and very much like Malcolm, he was an internationalist. I mean, in the fullest sense of the word, because his association, with Russia at that time during the Cold War period, obviously made him a target of inspection and examination and surveillance,
Yeah.
almost to the point of like making sure that they interceded in his life, made intercepted a lot of things he was trying to do because he understood exactly that here's this his anti he's an anti he's an anti-capitalist, he's an anti-imperialist, someone who was very much in opposition to the American foreign policy. So that would make him, an automatic target, of the CIA, to the point that they moved to, and Paul Jr. told me these stories in terms of when he went to Moscow when his father was ailing. And
Mhm.
apparently, like Malcolm in Cairo, he had been drugged.
Yes.
The Culture is the organization at that time created by the CIA. It's almost like go back to check out the film, the Manchurian Candidate.
Yes, sir.
Where people begin to drop drugs on you, and we have at least two or three instances in which agents or former agents, were forced to commit suicide. So I guess they were trying to make sure and intercept the activism, the internationalism of a Paul Robeson at that time, to the point of inducing him and hitting him with all kinds of drugs. And Paul Jr. got hit with the same thing apparently when
Mhm.
he went over there. Then his his wife had to come over, his mother had to come over to see Paul's seniors. You know, Islanda had to come there and find out what was happening with her husband. So here's this here thing where the intrigue, the international intrigue, got so deep that the CIA was so concerned about the influence. I mean, it's the international influence that Paul Robeson had at that time, and it would kind of nullify that to the point of like inducing him, you know, the whole depression thing and forcing
Yes.
him into possible suicide or drugging him. So those are some of the speculations, some of the things that we derive, you know, in the research there. And there's a lot of work that's going on over the years about Paul Robeson and his connection, you know, as a fellow traveler, you know, hooked up with the Communist Party, with communist organizations, his relationship, although they had some differences later on, particularly during the Stalin period, but there was nonetheless during the Cold War, the McCarthy thing.
Hmm.
And of course,
Hmm.
that's when a lot of the other African Americans who were fellow travelers fell under the microscope, you know, of the CIA and the FBI. People sometimes say, oh, well, they're not the same. Well, they share information. You know, one is more interested in the domestic differences, the whole COINTELPRO thing, you know, with the Black Panther Party and all the offshoots there, the radical, the militants, you know, of the 1960s and 70s. The FBI was on their trail, to say nothing. You talk about a Kwame Ture, a Stokely Carmichael, or A. Trap Brown, you know, or right into all of the Huey Newtons, the people who were, you know, who were concerned with, you know, the development of politics in this country. All of them were under FBI surveillance. I think the book that there's a couple of books. The one by Claiborne Carson, they call it FBI Files. It's really centrally involved with Malcolm,
Yeah.
but just like our book on the Malcolm X and CIA, their book on the FBI spills over in such a way it just touches just about every
Yes, sir.
activist out there.
Yeah.
They then the name end up in that book, you
Hmm.
know. So we were trying to say like, okay, you know, how many of these other from an international standpoint, and Don was so absolutely crucial in making me understand better, you know, what was happening in Grenada going back to 1983, the whole New Jewel movement, you know, what was going on with Maurice Bishop, the discord, you know, within, and of course it cries out for a book.
Yes, it
And
does.
I think a documentary that he's working on right now will be shed a little bit more light on
Hmm.
that particular very, very tumultuous period of Grenadian history.
Let me put a pin on a couple things that you said. One, you mentioned Imam Jamil Alameen, the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee. Whenever we are doing something, we also supporting our political prisoners. We did not have anyone available from the Imam Jamil Alameen Action Network, but we do want to remind everyone that the Imam is fighting for his freedom while fighting terminal cancer. So be on the lookout for any point of action regarding him. The next point of action is going to be the release of a film that his son has worked very laboriously on to help spell out his story and spell out his frame up. So look forward to that. And one of the things that we'll be trying to do is to add another wrinkle to our work with the organization is a Malcolm X Human Rights Festival, when we show targeted films like that in a community organizing context. Now, on Black Panther Party, you mentioned, we just lost Sekou Udenga not just a couple of Mississippi minutes ago, who was very dear to us in the New York
Oh,
area,
yes.
right? And Sekou was in Algiers when the party and Eldridge went to form that international arm of the party in Algiers. You may want to share a few words about that linkage. Can you hear us?
You still there?
Yeah, no, we hear you. We hear you. We hear you fine.
Somebody's been trying to bugging me on this phone.
Oh,
Go ahead, Zach. I'm not
yeah,
here.
and that's all right. We understand. We're both busy, and we're coming also up the time too. And I don't want to stay our time. But I wanted you to have some words on what you came up with around the move of the Panthers to Algeria, right? The Algiers chapter, and I'm thinking just in memory of Sekou Odinga, who we just lost recently.
There's a couple of books out there. One by, strangely enough, an Algerian woman who was working in and around, with the party. Once they took up residence there, and in Algiers, and they talk about Donald Cox, who was a field marshal at that time, and
Bill Marshall, D.C.
exactly, you know, I would love to see. There's a couple of long documents on what he had to say about that situation there, but we kind of touch on that, uh, particularly. The two people I knew who were part of that, who left and broke away, was, of course, Michael Tabor, or Seteweo,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and his companion or wife at that time, Connie Matthews.
Mm-hmm.
The two of them were there, and I had opportunities to travel from Mbeya in Tanzania all the way across the mountains to Lusaka, where Connie and Michael Seteweo, where they lived. I spent time with them on two occasions in the 70s, and had a chance to spend hours, days with Seteweo when he was working on his book, about the whole how the genocide, of Black Americans was being perpetrated by the agencies in this country, and so there where he began to explain the situation, what was going on with the differences that they had, and but most of it was the antagonism of Eldridge Cleaver at that time,
Yeah.
and
And
of
the party
course,
was going through a very difficult split at that
yeah,
time.
a
Yes, sir.
lot of that can be found in a couple of books have done a pretty decent job on that. We didn't want to spend too much time on that because we had so much ground to cover.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to make sure that the international connections were made, particularly with the New Jewel movement, particularly with Walter Rodney, which I think is probably another very interesting connection with Malcolm because of what he represented in the Caribbean. So
Mm-hmm.
in effect, we touched a little bit on the African connection in terms of Patrice Lumumba, but so much work had been done on that. We didn't need to go over that ground again. The FBI's connection there was absolutely conclusive. There was no doubt about that, the role that they played there. But to show that, and even now, as we talk about the centennial of Malcolm X, we can't ignore the centennials of Patrice Lumumba, as
And
well
France
as
Fanon.
and Frantz Fanon.
You could beat me
You
to the
know,
punch.
exactly. So all of these three individuals and a kind of a triangle,
Mm-hmm.
from the American, from U.S. all the way to Africa to the Caribbean, all of them born in 1925. And of course, I always speculated, did they ever come together?
Oh my
Well, it
God.
couldn't have in one way because of the geographical aspects at the times of their lives, because by the time Malcolm reached this kind of international notoriety as such, they were dead. They
Right.
both were
Both.
gone in the
That's right.
early 60s, 62,
61 respectively.
61.
Both of
They
them
were
60.
gone. Malcolm did not get the kind of international attention until he left the Nation of Islam to a
Indeed.
great extent.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, just the conjunction of the trajectory of their lives, in the same way that Malcolm began to kind of bend a little bit toward the so-called civil rights leaders in America. And
In
that's another
pursuit
interesting
of building
story,
the
right?
United Front.
Yes. We could spend a whole, we could
Yes,
do
sir.
chapter and verse on that one.
Which is
Uh,
very important for this moment as we deal with these crazy folks pushing us to fascism.
hmm
Yes, sir. If I
But I
must say.
mean, you go back to like even like with Malcolm, went down to Selma, Alabama.
Oh God,
But even
yes.
before that, Malcolm had reached out to Martin on at least three other occasions, and of course they have that historic meeting that kind of shook hands in the nation capitals in 19,
March of
yeah,
'64.
that's
Yes.
64,
Hmm.
1960, March of 64, when they were debating the whole Civil Rights Act in this country. But then when Martin got the Nobel Peace Prize and came back to Harlem at the
Yes.
Armory,
Yes.
142nd Street Armory, and to speak there, Cleveland Robinson, the great labor leader, was there, and Andrew Young was essentially responsible for that rendezvous. Malcolm was there in the audience. He sat in the
Hmm.
audience with Andrew Young at that time.
Hmm.
Then, of course, Malcolm, had the going down to Selma, Alabama. Dr. King was in jail at that
Yes,
time,
sir. Yes,
but
sir.
Malcolm met, with Coretta Scott King and told her, "Do you tell your husband we got his back?"
That's right.
And then, of
That's
course, Malcolm came up to Harlem well, coming to Harlem was not coming home. He spoke several times there with the Socialist Workers Party and even on a forum, with Fannie Lou Hamer, to
yes.
say nothing of meeting John Lewis during
Yes.
his trip, his voyage, his pilgrimage to Africa.
Yes.
So he was
Yes.
kind of reaching out, to the civil rights movement, and letting them know that, hey, maybe we need to pull this thing together, consolidate,
Malcolm,
concerns we have.
coalition builder.
You have
Yes, sir.
different tactics, different methods, different
Mhm.
understandings, but in many ways, we're on the same page. So it's a lot of speculation about, a lot of people kind of like dismiss, debunk the whole idea that Malcolm was trying to have some kind of reach some accord, with the civil rights movement. But there was some indication to suggest that he certainly had part of his agenda, of course,
Mhm.
his largest agenda is to internationalize the plight of the struggle of Black Americans.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of evidence that shows Malcolm in correspondence reaching out to Dr. King in a very coalition building way, even in his glory days with the nation, even before he left the nation. Because that's one of the dimensions of Malcolm's legacy that I think often gets looked. One, that he was an incredible organizer, and as an organizer, he was a very good coalition builder. So I just wanted to put a pin in it, and I appreciate you lifting up the connect to Fanon and Lumumba, because of course we have to do that. We're trying to figure out our activities for July because Mr. Fanon, well, Dr. Fanon and Mr. Lumumba both had July birthdays. So we're trying to figure out some activities for July. There's a great film out called The Soundtrack to a Coup, on the coup of Patrice Lumumba, that is getting some mileage, and it should. I've seen excerpts of it. It's a loaded film, so I really
Hmm
wanted to appreciate that. Now, in respect for your time, what are some of the takeaways that you want to make sure that we get for this audience for the work that you and Don have done, and where else do we need to go in terms of building out and continued scholarship on Malcolm's legacy?
Like you say, we just threw the shovel in the turf and overturn a bit of the soil, but there's so much digging that has to be done there to kind of reach some very definitive and conclusive things about what happened with Malcolm's life and assassination. And I think as the pressure is put on the government, I'm glad to hear that the attorney Donald Crump, just even at the events, leading up to the celebration or
Yes, yes.
commemoration that we had for his birthday, the centennial thing, and he mentioned that the lawsuit, the very heavy lawsuit that they're bringing against government agencies, and whether or not that would bear fruit. That would be critical information that we need to kind of push this thing to the next stage of understanding about Malcolm's very, very consequential days among us. He only did 39 years. It's amazing that
Right.
he and Dr. King, both at 39,
Yeah.
was gone, and some other youthful revolutionaries we lost at the same time. So we've had some setbacks, on the in the front and struggled for total liberation in our society. All across the years, it's been that case. But losing Malcolm was a critical piece
That's
as we
huge.
began to formulate and understand where we stand in this here world that becoming each day more difficult. This is the whole African Liberation Day today, but you think about the roles that are being played, by the Trump administration to just nullify and destroy, to erase, all of that we've conquered up to this point. So if nothing puts us on guard and prepares us for the next stage of the struggle, Trump is certainly an instigator in that sense. I mean, we should heed everything that he's doing and make sure we counter, some of the moves he's making, and some of the things we did in the 1960s. We may have to bring them back into effect again, to say nothing, of the organizing, and we can come together. Even one of my friends was telling me, he says, "Hey, we got to, first of all, you have to organize. We have to come together, and then when we come together, we have to make sure that the ideas are put on the table in terms of how we move forward.
Yes,
We
sir.
still need to have a solid understanding of what happened in the 1960s, a good analysis of that, the strengths and weaknesses of all of that. So, in other words, once you come together, you study together, you form ideas for struggle together, you work in concert, you stay together.
Yes, sir.
You can come together, you got to stay together, and then you got to put those ideas into practice.
Yes, sir.
Whatever theories that are put out there, let's take the best of them and make them manifest in such a way as we can begin to defeat the forces of the diabolical forces of evil that are against us.
Yes, sir. And that's a great way to wind this up. I hope our younger organizers are taking notes. I want to shout out Todd Stephen Burrows,
Oh,
uh,
yes.
Charles Brooks, with the organization, wrote very well for us in the organization. We got shout outs to Teak in Roxbury and Malcolm's Massachusetts home. Todd, I want to shout you out, little brother, because Todd co-edited the other response to Manning Maribel's The Lie of Reinvention. Right. I want to thank all of them for chiming in. Principal Baruti Kafele, one of our legendary educators, among the folks that have been chiming in as we've been having this conversation. Our next Revolutionary Fourth Sunday will be on the 22nd of June, on the heels of Juneteenth activity. We're working out the ideas. We have two different conversations on the table we're trying to work out with our
Hmm.
comrades' schedules to figure out when that's going to be next. We put in the chat the Third World Press,
Yes.
right? From your best black book dealer or Third World Press directly. Get this book. Get Malcolm Real Not Invented, and investing in the diary, even though it's an expensive collectives item now.
Yeah.
If
There's a
you're
few
still
out there. Yes.
out there, that's right.
Hmm.
Malcolm sacrificed his life. You may want to sacrifice a few dollars. Why that is so important, right? So, Mr. Boyd,
All
sir,
right.
I appreciate you. Give
Oh, I
Don
love
my
you.
love and care.
Oh, my
Salute
goodness.
everybody, Ron. We appreciate what you did in putting that delegation together. Glad to have somebody in our ranks on that trip. We got to bring our stuff closer together too, and we got to bring forward those young heads like Kim Poole and those younger forces. We got to bring them forward too, because none of us are getting younger, that's for sure. And I
No.
have young folks reminding me of that every day.
Hey, you're doing some wonderful work. I'm looking at the lineup of activities you've had over the last couple of weeks, and that's a tremendous undertaking. That's
Yeah,
not an easy endeavor,
all
coordinating
over
all
the
these different
world.
groups and
Oh,
individuals to
oh,
show up on the show to
oh my
express
goodness.
their understanding of these the heroes that and heroes that we had that, and you've recognized them over the years through your various affiliations and organizations. So all power to you, brother. We push on forward ever, and backwards never.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. X's and Malcolm is the answer. All power to the people, free the land, and we'll see everybody in the world win. Hold on to June 22nd. That'll be our next Revolutionary Fourth Sunday.
Thank you. Aluta continua.
All right. I think